We're going to start the peripheral nervous system. So remember, this is outside of brain and spinal cord. So once that nerve exits the spinal cord through the intervertebral foramen, we're now in peripheral nervous system. This is the little flow chart that we've seen before. I just want to make sure we go through it, that you know you have the peripheral nervous system. It can be divided into sensory information that's going to the brain, right? So you're hot, you're cold. And then we're sending motor messages out the peripheral nervous system. So those motor messages have two different pathways. They're either going somatic, and here I think skeletal. So you've got a motor message coming from the brain, and it's sending messages to either your skeletal or it's sending messages to your autonomic. So I'm thinking organs like digestion, heart rate. So A and S, you really should be thinking smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. And then we're further going to split autonomic nervous system. That'll be chapter 14, where we look at whether we have sympathetic, which is speed up, or whether we have slow down messages being sent to our organs. We have to look at several sensory receptors. So remember, this is information to the brain, and that's sensory. So there are many different types of receptors, and those types are specialized to respond to changes in the environment. If you activate them, you're going to trigger a graded potential, you're going to trigger nerve impulses, you're going to trigger an action potential, and that'll travel on neurons to your brain, and then you'll go to a specific section of your brain and you'll register. Oh, that sensation of heat came from my hand on my right side. So awareness of the stimulus is sensation, and interpreting it is perception. So first you have to feel it, then your brain has to figure out where's it coming from. 3 ways to classify receptors. We're going to go through each of these types. You look at it by what type of stimulus does it react to, where is it in the body, and is it complex or simple. So you can see the root word here, and you can see that most of these make sense except for nociceptors. So mechanical receptors, some sort of movement. Oh, I can't write today. Movement stimulus. So some sort of movement stimulus is going to cause these receptors to fire, generate an action potential, and send a message to the brain. Thermoreceptors. So some sort of temperature is going to activate a neuron. That neuron is going to fire, have an action potential, and that's going to send a message to the brain. So photoreceptor, light is the stimulus. Chemoreceptors, chemicals. Nociceptors, pain. So pain-causing stimulus like inflammation, extreme heat or cold, excessive extreme pressure. So all of these stimuli are going to activate a nociceptor. That nociceptor is going to generate an action potential. That action potential is going to travel to the brain, and then your brain has to decide what it's going to do about it. This one's pretty simple too. Where do we find them? So we're looking at receptors, and where are these receptors located? You either have receptors that are external, outside the body. You have internal receptors. So these are in the viscera, the blood vessels inside. And then you have proprioceptors or proprioceptors. So remember, these we've talked about before. They respond to stretch and skeletal muscles and joints and ligaments. These are the ones that tell your brain body position. Tell your brain your current body position. They're constantly sending messages to your cerebellum, updating the contractility of the muscles or the movement or their current station. So informs the brain of one's body position or movement. We can also look at receptors based on how complex they are. So these we're not going to talk about. Complex receptors we're going to talk about in chapter 15. These are the ones that are specialized for your senses, like vision and hearing and equilibrium. Really, we're just going to look at simple receptors. So these are tactile, like touch, pressure, stretch, vibration, temperature, pain, muscle sense. When we look at simple, remember we're going to do complex later. So these are both simple. We have two different subclasses. They're either encapsulated, free nerve ending, or encapsulated. So if they're free nerve endings, you find these in epithelial, connective tissue, they're non-myelinated, they respond to temperature, pain, or light touch. The encapsulated nerve endings are almost always mechanoreceptors, and they're going to be in some sort of connective tissue, and they're going to vary. There's a bunch of variation here you'll see on the next slide. These non-encapsulated dendritic endings, we have thermoreceptors, nociceptors, light touch receptors. When I say this, hopefully we're thinking about our neuron. Sorry, this is as good as it gets, right? So these are dendrites. Here's my soma. Here's my axon. Here's my axon terminals. So what's the whole point? What are we trying to do? We're trying to activate a receptor. What do we want to generate? An action potential. That's going to cause a neurotransmitter release, and that could possibly go to another neuron, right? And we'll have a chain link of them, and then eventually we'll get to our brain. So you're taking some sort of stimulus, activating the receptor, generating an action potential, neurotransmitter released, and eventually, hopefully, the message gets to the brain. So these are the non-encapsulated ones. They don't have they aren't covered with connective tissue. So here's the table. You can see free nerve endings, non-encapsulated. They're showing you tactile cells. They're showing you hair follicles. And they mention thermoreceptors, some chemoreceptors, some nociceptors. Here are the encapsulated. So they have connective tissue which enhances sensitivity. So this should remind you of myelin, right? When we wrapped our neurons in myelin, what did it do? It increased sensitivity. So now we're wrapping connective tissue around our dendritic endings, and that's increasing sensitivity of the neuron response. So mechanoreceptors like Mesner's, tactile corpuscles, Pacinian, lamellated corpuscles, Golgi tendon organs, joint proprioceptors, muscle spindles. So a lot of mechanoreceptors here. We're going to increase or enhance sensitivity with these structures. Here's a table of all the encapsulated. So you can see they have connective tissue wrapped around them. You can see where they're located, what type of receptors they are, where you can find them, like external proprioceptors, mechanoreceptors. So all of these are going to enhance the signal. Survival depends on sensation and perception. You have to feel it, and then you have to interpret it. So where did it come from? Where's the pain, right? And then what action are you going to take? So somatosensory system, part of the sensory system serving the body wall and the limbs. Input comes from external receptors, proprioceptors, and internal receptors. You can see here in this picture, they're showing you the receptor level. So here's a muscle spindle, here's a free nerve, here's a joint. All of these dendrites, if the receptor is activated, right? So we have a stimulus, the receptor gets activated, we generate an action potential, that's a P, action potential. The message travels up the spinal cord, through the brainstem, to our thalamus, which if you remember, this is our relay, and then we send the message to a specific section of our brain. In this case, we're talking about the somatosensory cortex. So this is where all this information is going, and hopefully it's going to then be conceptualized, right? You're going to interpret where these messages are coming from. So they're just saying processing at the receptor level, basically generating the signal. For sensation to occur, the stimulus must excite the receptor, you must generate an action potential, and it must reach the central nervous system. Adaptation is a change in sensitivity in the presence of a constant stimulus. So receptor membranes become less responsive and the receptor potentials decline in frequency or stop. So we have the ability to adapt. Pain is not as easy to adapt to, but you can adapt smell, touch, right? You can forget that you're touching someone. You can, I usually think of smell here. We adapt pretty quickly to smell, but this is a complex sense that we'll talk about later. So pain is not as easy. You'll see in just a second. Hold on. So here we have phasic or fast adapting receptors. So the signal at the beginning or the end of the stimulus. This is pressure, touch, and smell. So you can think these have fast adaptation capabilities. Tonic receptors adapt slowly or not at all. So examples are nociceptors and most proprioceptors. We don't want to quiet this, right? Proprioceptors tell you about your body position. We want to make sure that we always know the position of all of our joints and muscles. We don't want to quiet that signal or adapt that signal. Pain receptors, this is telling you something's wrong, right? Imminent threat, you're getting ready to hurt yourself permanently. So we don't want to quiet that either. These are things that may not kill us, they're just irritating. So it's okay if we phase out. Again, smell. If you walk into somebody's house and they have 5 dogs, you might first walk in and go, oh wow, house smells like dog. But while you're sitting there having a conversation with the person, your brain doesn't want to keep saying, ooh, I smell dog, I smell dog, I smell dog. So basically you can adapt those neurons and they won't fire. The receptors won't trigger the neuron to fire, and you can adapt to where the brain is not receiving those signals. The other slide was telling you at the receptor level. These are just telling you circuit level. So this is spinal cord, brainstem. Perceptual level, that goes all the way out to your cerebral cortex. So perception of pain. Pain is actually a good thing. What is pain telling you? Impending tissue damage, basically saying stop whatever it is you're doing. So extreme pressure, temperature, histamines is like inflammation, potassium, acids, low blood pressure, ATP, lots of ATP. So this one I usually think of, remember potassium is supposed to be inside cells. So should ATP. That should be inside, right? If these two things are in abundance, and they're not inside cells, it's free floating around enough to trigger a neuron to fire, that means you had to have had some sort of cell death. Something's not right. This is an interesting phenomenon, referred pain and visceral pain. So visceral pain is pain that results from the stimulation of visceral organ receptors. So these would be internal, right? Enteroceptors. You might have a vague aching or gnawing or burning. It's an internal receptor is activated. And what are we doing? We're causing the neuron to fire and send a message to the brain. But it's an overall, we don't know exactly where it's coming from. Exact source, not always clear. Referred pain is when pain from one body region is perceived as coming from a different region. So what happens is the visceral, the internal, and the somatic, skeletal, so this would be skeletal. Visceral is going to be probably smooth muscle or cardiac. Both of these fibers, they're two different fibers. This one's going off to skeletal. This one's going off to some sort of smooth muscle, cardiac. But when they come back into the spinal cord, the brain can't tell exactly where they're coming from within the body. So this is why sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, they have left arm pain when they're having a heart attack. What we're saying is, here's your heart, right? If your heart, it's sending a message to your spinal cord, it's going up to your brain, and then your brain has to interpret, right? It has to decide what is this message that's coming in. Well, guess what? If your arm is also hurting too, they're saying this nerve for your arm goes into your spinal cord at the same location and then goes up to the brain. So your brain has, let's say it has a gyrus, And that gyrus is receiving both messages right here. Both of those messages are being dumped on that particular part of the brain. Your brain can't tell where the pain is coming from, really. It's kind of just, oh, it's somewhere over here in this area. There are some interesting phenomena that can occur. This one specifically, phantom limb pain. So this is the person is experiencing pain in the limb that's been amputated. So now they'll use an epidural anesthesia in surgery, and they see that it is reducing phantom pain. So basically, remember, when you anesthetize a nerve, that's 100%, off, if you will. So you've completely turned that nerve off before you do the amputation, and that seems to reduce the phantom pain. This should look very familiar to you, right? Structure of nerves. We're going to have an endoneurium, a perineurium, and an epineurium. We saw this before, right, with bones, right? We had an endosteum, right, periosteum. So endo is the connective tissue that encloses the axon and the myelin sheaths. Perineurium, connective tissue that bundles the fibers into fascicles. And the epineurium, that's the tough fibrous sheath around the outside. Here's the image for you. This outer bundle, that's the epineurium. Then each fascicle is wrapped in perineurium, and then each individual neuron, remember axon is just part of the neuron, can be wrapped in endoneurium. And just in case you don't believe me, right? So what's each one of these little circles? These are all neurons. And they're bundled in these fascicles, and then they're bundled in epineurium. And around each neuron is the endoneurium. To classify nerves, we classify them as spinal or cranial. Remember, we're still in peripheral nervous system. So here's my brain, and here's my spinal cord. I'm saying if a nerve comes out of the spinal cord, it's called a spinal nerve. We have some nerves that come out of the brain, and those are called cranial nerves. And we're going to go over the cranial nerves. There's 12 of them. Most nerves are a mix of afferent and efferent. They want you to realize that you have sensory messages going up and that you have motor messages coming down. Please make sure you go back and look at those words and which one means exiting, ascending, exiting, right? So nerves are classified according to the direction that they transmit impulses. So if you're a sensory nerve, you're going towards the brain. If you're a motor nerve, you should be going away from the brain. But remember, these spinal and cranial are mixed. They have both sensory and motor fibers in them. Some cranial, they'll be specific and have only sensory. We'll talk about that in a minute. Continuing with classifying the nerves, if you remember the term ganglia, or you should, go back and remember if you have a collection of somas. So here are these are somas or cell bodies. These are axons. If I have a collection of somas in the peripheral nervous system, I call them ganglia. If I have a collection of somas in the central nervous system, remember we called it nuclei. And then axons, we had tracts in the central nervous system, and then we just called them nerves in the peripheral nervous system. So peripheral nervous system axons can regenerate. So if the soma is intact, the peripheral axon may, and that's a key word there, may regenerate. Most central nervous system fibers never regenerate.